Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day 3 of the virtual 737 course. And today's a good one. Today we get to go flying.
All of them are good, Ben. All of them are good.
All of them are excellent.
All of them are excellent. Like, you wouldn't want to miss this for the world.
No.
Like, unless it's someone's funeral or something, this is the place to be.
It is. And all of our hard work over the last few days has kind of pushed us into this position now. And it feels kind of good when you're doing it right and you know that you have put all the work in, you set it up exactly as you would do in real life, you program the FMC like a pro. The airplane's now in a position where we can actually push back and we can do it absolutely properly. So
I mean, the amount of like humor that's coming out of you is amazing. We've pushed us into this position. Like it's pun after pun that's just coming through.
I'm here all night. It's great to see so many of you signing in. And if you're watching this live back from a recording, welcome to you as well.
Yeah.
Great. So we had sorry, Petter. Yes.
Yeah, no. I was just saying that it's absolutely fantastic to be here again, and I'm looking forward to actually get this beast airborne. Like that's the point. That's the point. We've been spending 3 hours to get it to this point, so let's get this thing into the air.
Let's get it moving. The passengers are being very, very patient today, so we're going to jump into the sim and we're going to carry on exactly where we left off yesterday. So if you haven't seen those videos, head over to either Mentor Now or the Facebook group, and you'll be able to catch up day 1, day 2. But we're back in a position where everything's done. The doors are closed. Passengers are sitting down. The passenger safe takeoff safety briefing is going on in the background now. Everyone's kind of getting ready. The ground crew are around, and we're getting into a position now where we're going to push back and start. Now, to get this going, we would push back and start probably simultaneously. But just for the purpose of this, we're going to start the pushback, and I'm going to talk you through what we're actually going to be doing during the start, and then we'll start once we finish the pushback so that it doesn't all happen at once. Yeah. And we can kind of show you what we're doing and why we're doing it as well. So let's have a look. So before we go, so we've done the last thing we finished with yesterday was the before start checklist to the line.
Yes.
Now, if you've got your workbooks, I think it's on page 12. You've got your workbooks there. You'll see that there's a line that we go to. So we say the before start checks to the line. So what's the significance, Petter, of that line there?
Right. So below this line, we will actually start to move the aircraft. Right. So up until this line, the checklists are the checklist items are there to make sure that the aircraft is ready to start its engines. And below the line, we will now start to basically tell ground crew that we're going to be moving. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the significance. Below the line, the aircraft will be set up to start the engines, as in like to finish off the before start checklist, and we're going to be switching on the anti-collision lights, telling all of the ground crew outside that there's potential danger, move away from the aircraft.
Correct. Yeah. So we're going to do that. So now we've done this, everything's done. So before we call for start, in real life, what we do is we speak to the ground crew down below. So they're plugged into a headset on the right side of the aircraft. In the Max, it's actually in the wheel well because it's a bit higher. But we would make contact with them. So if I take the position of, the pilot, and Petter, if you maybe take the position of ground crew, we would go. I'd press the button to talk to ground crew, which is the flight interphone button, and I would say, "Flight deck to ground. Good afternoon. Hello, ground." And that's probably what would happen in real life. There's no one...
Go ahead.
There you go. They're getting the headset on. Okay, good. Okay, so can you confirm the bypass pin's installed, all doors, hatches are closed, and ground equipment is removed?
Affirm, sir. All external checks complete. The bypass pin is installed, and we are ready to push and start, sir.
Good. So that's the first check we do. We just make sure everyone downstairs is ready, because what we don't want to be doing is calling for push and start, and then we find, and they clear us for push and start, and then we find the ground crew aren't ready, and that messes up ground control, air traffic control, because we're not ready. So we make sure they're ready. They are ready. So then we would make sure the cabin is secure, which it is, and we would call ground now for clearance, call air traffic control for clearance to push back and start engines. So we don't move on a busy airport unless we have clearance to do so. So our call sign is Butter01. We're on stand 53 right in Stansted. So we give that information and tell them that we're ready. We'd like to request push. So it'll be Stansted ground. Good evening. This is Butter01 on stand 53 right, requesting push and start.
Butter01, very good evening to you. Off stand 53, right, you cleared push and start. Call me back, ready for taxi.
Push start approved, Wilco Butter01. Great. So now we've got everything kind of aligned. We've got the ground crew ready. We've got clearance to push and start. But before we go, we need to now finalize the aircraft, do a few more final steps before we go to make sure that we're ready to go. So that's called, we action the below the line checks. So I will do it first, and then I call for the checklist. So when you're doing this at home, do it yourself, and then we can run through the checklist. So the first thing we do is we turn the air conditioning packs to off, and we put the APU air on. Yes,
there's been a little bit of a discussion here now. When did we actually start the APU? So that's probably worth mentioning, because we left the APU off because we wanted to save on fuel and so on. So it's good. It's for those of you who have already noticed it. Kudos, very good. We would start the APU when we get the load sheet. So when the load sheet is there, we know that all of the passengers on board, that's when we will start the APU. And if we don't start the APU, and we haven't started it at this point, we're going to be sitting here well ashamed, because it's going to take us a few minutes to get that thing started. And that's time that the tower will be waiting for us to move. So Ben has been a good boy and has started the APU, and he did so when the load sheet arrived. So great question.
Yeah, very good spot. You guys really are paying attention. You're calling us out here, so that's amazing. But yes, generally before this point, we would start the APU. And I know it's running. You can check it's running because you can see the APU exhaust gas temperature is around the 400 degrees. And if you want to check, you can go up here and go to APU Gen, and you can see, sure enough, we've got some readings up there, so we know that it's running. So the APU is on, so very well spotted. So we turn the packs off, we turn the APU bleed on, which allows compressed air from the APU right at the back of the aircraft to be sent down into the pressurization, or into the air manifold, ready to spin the engines, because the engines, unlike your car, are actually started with compressed air, not like some kind of electric starter motor. So we need that compressed air to spin the engines up before we can introduce fuel and ignition. And we turn the packs off to make sure that we're not overburdening it, because if we've got the air conditioning packs on, not only does the APU have to spin the engines now, which is quite a big demand for it, it has to power the air conditioning, and it would very rapidly run out of puff. So we turn those off first of all. And a quick talk, because I get this question quite a few times actually, is why do we start engine number 2 first? So we've got engine 1 on the left side, engine 2 on the right side, and we always normally start engine number 2. And there's a reason for that. Peter, do you want to go into that, or do you want me to go into that?
So yes, there is a reason for that. As you can see, that the air that's coming out of the APU will go from the APU and into the left side of the manifold. So that's the left side that goes primarily first to engine number 1, and then it goes through the isolation valve to engine number 2. Okay. We want to start engine number 2 to make sure that the isolation valve is working properly. So if the isolation valve, for example, is stuck in closed, well, then we will notice this at, here. When we try to start in number 2, it won't work because the air will not reach the engine. So that would be that's just a kind of a confidence call for us to make sure that that's happening. It's a similar reason to why we always start with the what's it called, the
ignition, the igniter
in right when we're at the home base, because a right igniter, if the right igniter is not working properly, we're not allowed to dispatch. So we want to make sure that we know that when we're at the home base. So it's a similar reason for that.
Exactly right. And if you see, if I close the isolation valve to simulate that it was stuck closed, you'd see that this is the pressure in the left and the right manifold, and the left side is pressurized, but the right needle is showing 0. So we can see there's no pressure coming across here because it's blocked. So we start engine 2 because we've got to make sure the air gets through here and actually does start that. So exactly right. Hey, first one of the evening.
Exactly. Sorry, I was a little bit late. That should have come before we gave that explanation, but it's definitely a nerd bell warning for that.
Definitely. And don't be alarmed if you see a master caution come up with an air conditioning, because up here, if I go back to that panel, you can see we get this dual bleed light comes on. And all that's telling us is that the APU valve is open and our engine bleed switches are on. And there's a risk there that if the engines were running above idle thrust, that the amount of compressed air coming out the engine could actually back pressure the APU and damage it. And we wouldn't want that. But when the engines are shut down or a maximum of idle thrust, that doesn't matter. But that dual bleed light tells us that we've got 2 lots of bleed in the same manifold. So if you see that, it's doing exactly as it should do in real life. So we're going to turn the packs off, APU bleed on, and then we turn the anti-collision light on. So the red light now flashes underneath and on top of the aircraft, and that's a big warning sign to everybody on the ground that the aircraft is now not safe to approach. We're about to start the engines. And that's the only time we would put these on when we're at this stage. We checked that the parking brake is set, and it's not, so I'm going to set the parking brake. That was done yesterday. It must have come off. And then we move the, if I just come down here, our transponder is 1, 2, 3, 4. It was actually one, if my memory is correct from yesterday, 1153, I think. Let me just have a look. We're going to put that now to out off. Okay, and what out off does is it basically provides information to ATC on the ground. So it tells us that, it tells them we pop up on their ground radar display as Butter 001, and they know where we are, but we're not reporting our altitude, because if we did that, the aircraft that are flying and coming into land would see us on their TCAS, and it would cause some nuisance alerts potentially. So we just have out off at that point. And then we're in a position to call for the before start checks below the line.
Before start checklist below the line. You ready?
Go for it.
So, air conditioning packs.
Off.
Anti-collision light.
On.
Parking brake.
Set.
Transponder.
Out off.
That's the before start checklist complete.
Good. And one thing we were going to mention in the first one, which I would just bring up now, that when we're reading these in the sim, we don't have 2 of us normally, unless we're sharing a cockpit. So when you're doing this on your own in the sim, read it in the way that we would do what we call a non-normal checklist. So you can read the challenge, which is the left side, and the response, and then you can do what it tells you to do. And once you've done it, you repeat the response. So if I was going to do this on my own, I would say so packs off, and I'd look up off. Anti-collision light on, check it, and then repeat the response on. Parking brake set, transponder out off, and that's the way we would run it if we were single pilot as well. So we're now in a position where we're ready to start and push. So we now talk to ground crew and say, ground to flight deck, we've been cleared to push on start to the east line. The parking brake is set.
At cockpit ground, you can release your parking brake.
Okay, and if I just get rid of that, brakes released on time at time 39. And
thank you.
Good. So they make a note of that. So we're nicely on time, and then we're going to commence the push. So in PMDG, I'm just going to start it on here. So I'm just going to go start.
And flight deck from ground, commencing pushback.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got some automatic voices going on in here as well. Now, what we would do now is during the start, we'd be getting ready to start the engines. So while we're pushing here, I'm just going to talk you through the start process. So when we do go to start, we've got the engine start switches up here, and we're going to move this to ground. And we do that by pushing it in real life and rotating it until it says, if I just show you, we're going to move the engine 2 into the ground position. And what that's going to do is it's going to open the start valve. And on the engines here, you're going to see a yellow start valve open light come on. That tells us that the valve is open and allowing compressed air from the APU into the engine to get it spinning up. And then what we're waiting for then is for 25% to be indicated on our N2 indicator. That's the inner compressor. And that's the minimum speed that we would then enter fuel and ignition. So we would now bring the start lever down here from cutoff to idle detent. And when we do that, it fires the igniters in the engine, and it brings in fuel. So now we've got air, we've got ignition, and we've got fuel. That's the fire triangle, and it will start spooling up. And we'd look for EGT increasing, the exhaust gas temperature. We're looking for the N1, the big fan at the front, to start spinning. And we're looking for oil pressure to start rising. And once it gets to 56% here, these are held on by like a magnetic solenoid. Once it gets to 56, that should just pop off automatically. That will close the valve. Parking brake set, so I just set that now.
Yep. Push to complete, set parking brake, please.
Brakes are set. So we're waiting. So it's 56%, start a cutout, and then we would monitor engine number 2. We're making sure that it's stabilized and it's self-sustaining so it can run without the need for the APU to supplement it. So we're looking for the general rule to look out for is 2, 4, 6, 3. So 2 for the 20%, 4 for 400 degrees, 6 is 60% N2, and 3 is about 300 kilos an hour. So 2, 4, 6, 3 is kind of what we run in our head as a rough to make sure it looks sensible. Peter, anything you want to add about engine starts before we start setting fire to fuel?
No, not really. I mean, I think you've covered it quite well. Obviously, this is a phase that you have to be really, really careful with. There's been quite a few accidents lately regarding engines. So you want to make sure that the area is actually clear around you, which is the ground crew is supposed to kind of have a look for that. But it's also a good idea to look around you a little bit to see that everything looks good from your position, because these engines, once they do start, they become very loud. And they will suck in a lot of air and everything that's close to it.
Yeah. So what we would do now, if we're going to start engine 2, we say to ground crew, are we clear to start engine 2? And then ground crew.
Start engine number 2, sir.
Good. So they're on the ground. They're looking at engine 2. They're making sure the area is clear. And if Petter was in the right seat, he'd look over his right shoulder just to double check himself to make sure it's clear. And then we go, right, we are starting engine number 2. So let's bring this to life. To ground. Start valve open. And we start to see the engine spooling up. So there's N2.
Oil pressure.
There's oil pressure rising. We've got N1 up here at the top. And I'm waiting now for 25%. There's 22, 23, 24, 25. I bring that to idle. I'm counting to 15 in my head, 1001, 1002. And sure enough, we get light up. You can see the exhaust gas temperature now rising as the ignition is happening. And we can see the engine accelerating. So the big fan at the front is accelerating. The inner fan is accelerating. The exhaust gas temperature is rising. And we're waiting now for 56% here, at which point we should hear a click and the start valve open should come off. It should close. So 51, 52, 53, 54, 55. There's a click.
Start a cutout.
So monitor engine number 2.
Engine 2 is stabilized.
Good. So we've got 2, 5, 6, 3 thereabouts. We know that's sensible. The little red line has gone here. So now that engine is stabilized and it's running by itself. And now we're good to start engine number 1. So I say, can we start engine number 1?
You're clear to start engine number 1, sir.
Clear 1. I look out the window of my shoulder. It looks all nice and clear. So now I'm going to do exactly the same for engine 1. So go to ground. Start valve open. N2.
Oil pressure.
N1. And we're waiting for 25%. 23, 24, and 25. In goes the fuel and ignition, counting to a maximum of 15 seconds. If it doesn't, we would shut the fuel off. But we've got it. EGT is increasing. We have light up. We have N1 acceleration. We have N2 acceleration. The oil pressure is rising. So it's looking really nice. And this red line here shows you the start limit, the maximum temperature for start, which is 725 degrees on the 7.3 NG. So we're making sure that it stays below that red line.
Yeah, a good kind of pointer here is that the N2 should be leading the EGT. So as long as the N2 needle is kind of ahead of the EGT, you're doing quite well. But if the EGT would start to rise quicker, as in the needles would start to move quicker on the EGT, then you're generally heading towards a hot start, which is not a great thing. That works in NG, not on the Max though, I noticed.
Yeah, the Max is slightly different, and that's something we'll look at in coming up. But good. So we can see that these have automatically tripped off. Now the starter cutout we've got, and I would say monitor engine number 1.
Engine number 1 stabilized.
Good. So we've got engine number 1, and as soon as we get engine 1 stable, the ground crew might still be disconnecting tugs and tow bars. What we do first of all now is we can put our generators on the bus. So these switches here, if I go to this view, it might be easier. This is our electrical switching panel. So we've got the APU can power the main electrical buses, or we can have the engine. So now we don't need the APU anymore because the engines are running. So we're going to put these on, the lights go out. The APU is now not doing anything. So the APU gen is off the bus, which means we can now turn off the APU as we don't need that anymore. And that can shut down by itself, and it's saving a little bit of fuel. And they would now say, ground would say, right, we would say, 2 good starts, you're cleared to disconnect the headset, hand signals on the right with the pin. Have a good day.
Okay, perfect. We disconnect the headset, see you on the right with the pin. Have a nice flight, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And they would disconnect and they would start walking. The temptation now in real life is to get cracking and doing your switching and getting the aircraft ready for taxi. But we need to be very, very sure that they have disconnected. So what are you looking for, Petter, when you're sitting here in the jet now? You've just said that. What are you waiting to see before you do anything else?
Yep, so I am waiting for the tug in the tow bar to be disconnected and move away. So you can see the tug there in the background. Normally it's connected to a tow bar. Sometimes it's one of those lifters, so it doesn't have a tow bar. But I want that to move away. But then I'm waiting for the guy or the girl on the headset to go away and move, and show me the bypass pin, which is a flag on it. It's a red flag. And they will hold that up. And that's a sign to me that A, they're clear of the aircraft, they've moved away, and the bypass pin has definitely been removed. Because if they forget that, which has happened sometimes, well, then the hydraulic pressure is not going to be able to move our nose wheel steering. And obviously, we will notice that very quickly, because as soon as we start to taxi and try to move, nothing is going to happen, or try to steer, nothing is going to happen. But we are waiting for that to happen. And it's really, really important that we take the time to wait for that. Because if you're under time pressure, let's say that you have a slot that you have to try to make, or you have holdover time for your de-icing and you want to get going, if you don't wait for that, there has been instances where the pilots have just disconnected, done the off the start checklist quickly, and then started moving, and the ground crew was still kind of disconnecting. And that has led to aircraft taxiing with the tow bar still connected, which creates a lot of sparks and is really embarrassing. But even worse, it's been they've started to move when the headset was still connected. So the person who's on the headset has basically been having to throw themselves away, because this aircraft will start moving quickly. And of course, the add thrust is going to start sucking more air into the engines. It's very dangerous. So here, take your time.
Yeah, take your time. Make sure you're happy. Never rush in an airplane. As long as you're not on fire and you've got fuel, take your time. So now we've said goodbye, and we can go into our before taxi flow, which is in your workbook, kind of continuing on from page 13 at the top of my head. But you can follow us through and watch this back as we go through. So now we're going to move our start switches. Rather than going to ground, we're going to move them into continuous. Maybe I'll go to this view. It might be easier. We move them into continuous, and that just does exactly what it says. It provides continuous ignition to the engines. So during takeoff, we're close to the ground. We don't want those engines flaming out if we're going through moisture or for any other reason. So we've just got the igniters constantly firing in the engine, igniting the fuel. It doesn't need to be on, because the fuel that's already ignited in there is igniting the new fuel. But this is just belt and braces. So that goes to continuous. We then move up to our propeats. Now you can see the lights are off because the engines have started. They're in auto. Your probes outside the aircraft, your pitot probe, angle of attack, they're already heated. But we now put them on to be sure. If we needed engine anti-ice or wing anti-ice, we'd now put that on, but we don't today. It's a nice day. We now can put our air conditioning on. Particularly if it's a hot day, it can get very, very warm in the cabin very quickly at this point. So we're now going to put our packs to auto. We're going to put the isolation valve switch to auto in the middle position, and we're going to turn the APU bleed end off. And this is your standard position for the air conditioning now. So the left engine is supplying the left pack, and the right engine is supplying the right pack. And they're completely independent now, because this valve is now closed in the auto position. Good. We're going to come down then, and we do a flight control check at this point. So I'm going to go fully forward, fully back. We're going to go left and right, and we check the rudders. We go full left and full right to make sure that everything feels correct. There's no restrictions, and the controls are fully serviceable. We're then going to select our takeoff flap, which is flap 5. So we select that. We do a recall check, and this is a check now. When we press this button now, it's interrogating all of the aircraft's fault monitoring systems and saying, is anything hiding? Is anything not working that it shouldn't be? And we're looking, when we press this, we're looking for all the lights to light up. And then when we let go, there should be nothing left. Great. If there was a problem, one of the lights would stay on, and we'd have to address that problem there and then. So we check that that's now done. We blank the lower DU now, so we can press the engine button. That blanks that up. And we do that because it arms what we call the pop-up function. So if we have any any problems with the engines as we start taxiing or taking off now, if anything is exceeded, this bottom display unit will suddenly pop up and it catches your eye. Whereas if we just left this up, it becomes much harder to actually spot any exceedances, particularly at busy phases of flight. Good. And then I would call for the before taxi checklist.
Before taxi checklist. So, generators.
On.
APU.
Off.
Start switches.
Continuous.
Probe heat.
On.
Anti-ice.
Off.
Air conditioning.
Pax auto, bleeds on.
Isolation valve.
Auto.
Flaps.
Now for flaps, what we need to do is go back to our takeoff page, because this is where we need to double check that we've actually selected the right flap, because it's very easy if we're always taking off on flap 5, and today we might need flap 1 or flap 15 to take off, and we went into why and how to do that in our Q&A today, which was great fun. But we look here, we look on our takeoff page, and we're looking for our flap here. We point here, so it's 5 required. We've got 5 selected.
No, we don't.
Green light.
Wait, do we have 5 selected?
Let me have a look. I think we do. Let me have a look. Hang on.
It looks so much like flaps 10. Let's have a look. Yeah, it looks like flaps 5.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we got a good spot though. I wouldn't put it past me.
This is why I always check this very clear. Obviously, when you're sitting in the when you're sitting in the cockpit, it's not a problem. But it's super easy to go onto the wrong flap step there.
Yeah, and it does happen in real life. It's happened in real life amongst different airlines where people have taken off with the wrong flap. So it's 5 required, 5 selected, green light.
And stabilizer trim.
So we've got 6.0 units, 6.02 units required, 6.0 units set.
Right, so you might have to move the screen a little bit there because we're hiding. There we go.
There you go. So maybe move that back just a little bit more. There we go.
6, perfect. And the start levers.
Start levers are idle detent.
Flight controls.
Checked.
And lastly, recall.
Is checked.
Okay, that's the before taxi checklist complete.
Good. So now the aircraft is in a position that it's safe to taxi. We've got everything we need to do. Everything's done, and now we can focus entirely on the taxiing.
So let's have a look. Let's have a look, Ben, before we go, because now we've gone from cold and dark to this position. So let's have a look at the overhead panel and just verify, because this is what we were talking about before. Remember, we talked about that the Airbus has a completely black overhead philosophy. Boeing has kind of like a black overhead philosophy, but you can still see that there are a couple of lights there that are green and a couple of them are blue and so on. But the main thing here is that there's no amber lights. There's no warning lights on, because if there would be, that would have triggered a master caution here, which is why we do the recall as the last thing we do before we start moving. So recall picks up anything that is out of the direct view of the pilots, right? So if you have an amber light just in front of you in the cockpit, as in around the primary flight display, for example, that will not trigger a master caution, because according to the Boeing philosophy, it's in your line of sight, so you should see it. But anything that is above you on the overhead panel or behind you on the central panel, that will trigger it.
Yeah. And the other thing to be careful of is that it won't automatically always come on. So let's just say we accidentally turned off a fuel pump or it got knocked. You can see that we got an amber light up here that would be out of our peripheral vision, as Petter said, but we haven't got a master caution yet. And the reason behind that is because there's another pump powering that side of the system. So it's working. But if we now do a recall, say we're doing the recall check as part of that before taxi checks, when I press it now, all the lights should light up. But when I let go, one stays on. We've got master caution fuel. And what that tells us now is that one system in a multi-channel system is not on. So it's still working, but it's not working at its full potential. So we go up and go, oh, my head must have knocked that, put it back on, pressure goes out, and so does the master caution. If in the unlikely event that both were going to go off now, you would then get a master caution. So there is a bit of a logic behind the system there. If one is still working, you won't get it unless you press recall, which is why we need to interrogate that system. Good. So we've got a taxi. We briefed the taxi yesterday. We're expecting to go through this link, Charlie, up to Sierra 1. Okay. So we would call for, now I'm just going to have a look on here because someone in the comments I know did spot this. There is, and this is a sim thing. You can see there's a bit of a gap here, but it's not a discontinuity in here. So I'm just going to try and tidy that up by reducing the speed to something lower to see whether that makes a difference. Because and actually that tidies it up. You can see that it was struggling to make that turn. So by putting 200 knots at this point, it joins it up. It wouldn't necessarily do that in real life. You might just see that it overshoots the turn a little bit. But if you do ever see that on yours, just reduce the speed. We're not using VNav at that point anyway, so it won't make any difference to what we're doing, but it will just tidy up that page for you. All right. So shall I call for taxi, Petter, or do you want to call for taxi?
I can call for taxi. So Stansted Tower, Butter 001, request taxi.
Butter 01, taxi through Link Charlie, holding point Sierra 1, runway 22.
Taxi through Link Charlie, holding point Sierra 1, runway 22, Butter 001.
So we've got the clearance, and we'd now kind of just double check that actually matches what we were expecting. And if it didn't, we would get the charts out and go, okay, so we're actually going this way through. Now, Petra and I, and all of us now kind of know where we're going. So it's a nice, easy taxi for runway 22 today. So before we move, we would go clear left and
clear right.
Clear right. So again, a final check that we're safe to move. There's no other aircraft taxiing in on the west line that we said could be a bit of a threat for us today. And then we're going to reduce the brakes and we're going to go. So I'm going to take the brakes off. Now, on the 737 NG, we generally need to add some thrust to get moving. But on the MAX, the residual power in the engines is enough, even if you're heavy, to actually get you moving without moving the thrust levers. So we have to be a bit careful when you're flying the MAX. But for this, generally move it up to about 30% N1 works really well. So I'm going to add the thrust up now to about 30%. And you see we have a little cursor here, which tells you where it's going to end up. So it spools up really slowly, as you can see, and we just start to move. There's no rush with that. We don't want to be, we're a heavy thing. And I'm just going to get us back on the center line because the tug driver was obviously training, obviously a new guy.
Yeah, sorry.
And and when you're taxiing, a great kind of rule of thumb to use is, can you see this wiper bolt here or this light detector? If you put that over the extended center line, your nose wheel behind you is going to be bang on that center line. It's a great little hack.
I always use in the real aircraft. That's a great hack for here. In the real aircraft, I always use the middle between the two screens.
Yes,
because it's an easy kind of way when you're seeing and you're using your peripheral vision, you can just have the slot in between the two screens, have that kind of crossing the center line, then you bang on.
Yeah, that works really well as well. There's loads of little things. And it's when we're teaching command upgrade students, because that will be the first time they've actually taxied the aircraft, because there's no way of taxiing it from the right unless they have an extra tiller. So it does take a bit of getting used to. But generally going around corners, if you aim to go around a corner of more than 45 degrees like this, we just overshoot the taxiway line a little bit. And then we just do a nice gentle turn, ideally less than 10 knots of ground speed.
Yeah, because remember the nose wheel that's actually, directing the aircraft is behind you. It's pretty much behind, like straight below the entrance door to the cockpit.
Yeah.
So you're kind of steering an aircraft pretty much like you do on a larger truck or a trailer, where you're sitting in front of the wheels that are turning. So you have to keep that into account. The idea is to try to straddle the yellow line with the main gears, right? The yellow line is supposed to be in the middle of the main gears all the time.
Yeah. And the ground speed that we're referring to, I'm just going to bring it to a stop here. It's a bit violent, but my brakes seem to be either on or off. There's no feathering. Your ground speed when you're taxiing is just on the top left of your nav display. So generally for turns, 10 knots around bends works really well. If you're in a straight line, try and keep it less than 30 knots, and that will keep it nicely under control for you.
What about the taxi lights and the lights that we're using?
There you go. It's amazing. When you're not in the aircraft, the little things you forget.
I know this is one of the reasons that I don't do much flight simming on the PC, because I am it's such a tactile job. Yeah. It's such a thing that there's so much in your muscle memory from what you're doing. So I find myself when I'm doing it on a home simulator, especially my sons, I find myself sitting there with the mouse, and it's like things that I would just do without even looking in the real aircraft.
Yeah,
it's so easy to forget.
Yeah, it is, and it's like when you're sitting there and you go clear left, clear right. My hands just go up. You have 3 fingers, and you put them on. We put on our runway turnoff and our taxi lights at this point, so we make ourselves visible. But we go and we leave those on now. So we're now taxiing out, and normally what we would be doing once we clear the apron behind us, we would run the before takeoff checklists, and I would call for Petter to read that. But now we're at the holding point, And if we're doing it single pilot, I'd say it's probably a good idea to do it while you're stopped, because it can be tricky to do it. Also, as we're kind of pointing in the right direction, I always like to put my weather radar on to get a bit of a heads up in case there's anything nasty lurking in the departure routing that we don't want to be surprised with when we get airborne. So I would call now for the before takeoff checklist to the line.
Before takeoff checks to the line. Config.
So that's another thing we would do is I would take the brakes off. You know, where we did the config check where we bring the thrust forward and we hear the meek during the during the setup. When we do it now, we're making sure there is no noise, because everything should be set for takeoff. So all we do is you bring the thrust all the way up, all the way back. The thrust won't actually move, but we're making sure that it stays silent. So config checked. So, okay. And that now means that we are the aircraft is in a configuration that's safe for takeoff.
Yeah. So once again, this is something that came off these accidents that happened where people did forget to set the flaps before takeoff, and the takeoff configuration warning horn did not work for whatever reason, and it took off without it. So again, here's a safety barrier where we do this config check, and since we know that it worked 5 minutes ago when we were doing the check, and now it's silent, we can be pretty good confident that it's now set up properly. There's nothing in there that will kill us.
And this is the circuit breaker that controls the takeoff warning horn. So we always make sure that that one is definitely in. They've collared it here, but it's in and collared just to highlight it rather than out and collared. So that's the one that was popped in the Spanair one that meant that it didn't go off, unfortunately.
Yeah. So
config checked. Okay, flap. So I'm going to go back to my takeoff page. So we go 5. Hang on, let me slow the nose. 5, green light.
Stabilizer trim.
6.0 units set.
Takeoff briefing.
Okay, so now we just run through a basic briefing to familiarize ourselves with what we're doing and just to double check everything. So I go, the bleeds are on, the packs are auto, anti-ice is off, the engine out SID is straight ahead to 25 miles, climbing to 3,000 feet. Speeds, we've got 139, 139, 146, and we check that the 46 is up here. And a quick review of the departure, basically the first turn. So I look over at the FO and say, right, we're going over to 3.1 miles on the ISX. Then we make a right turn, 350 to Barkway, stopping at, and I point 4,000 feet, which is set. So we double check. So last point we can catch to make sure we have the right one set. The squawk is in. We've got it in here. And anything else we might want to add, but otherwise we would say reviewed.
Thank you. Cabin.
So at this point, the first officer would press the attend button to summon the cabin crew. There's ding dong in the cabin, and that just tells the cabin crew that we're ready for them to give us cabin secure. So they will be securing the cabin at this point to make sure that it's ready for takeoff. You see them going down the aisle, checking the things are closed, seatbelts are done up. And once the number one, the purser, has done that, they will come to the front and they will let us know that the cabin is secure. And the cabin is now secure.
Perfect. So that's before takeoff checklist down to the line.
Right. So now is where the action happens. We're at the holding point. The aircraft is primed. She's ready now to actually launch into the sky. We've done everything properly. And that's for me, when we're doing this at home, having that knowledge that we've done everything properly, the aircraft is set up in exactly the same way as it would be sitting here if Petra and I were at the hold in the real aircraft. There's nothing different. And we're now ready to go. So the takeoff, before we line up and talk about lining up and taking off, I'm just going to run you through what we look for and what we see, because it's going to happen quickly. So we're going to line up on the runway, and when we line up on the runway, we're cleared for takeoff. We're going to we're going to do the below the line checks first of all, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then first of all, we don't just add thrust to takeoff thrust. We're going to first go to 40% N1, and we make sure both engines are stabilized at 40% before we add any further thrust. And Peter, what's the significance of that?
Right. So the engines accelerate pretty slowly from ground idle, right? And because they have so much mass, because the giant fan in the front is so heavy, depending on what kind of crosswind you have and wind entering into the engine, stuff like that, they can accelerate at very different paces. So, and that difference mainly happens during the first few seconds. So if you accelerate both engines up to 40%, that difference will happen up to 40%, right? But once they're both spinning at 40%, there will be very minimal difference in their acceleration going forward. And that's important, because if you would just slam the thrust levers forward, well, then you might have one that's accelerating up to takeoff thrust immediately, and the other one is kind of lagging behind. And while that's happening, this one that's already giving full takeoff thrust is now going to try to push the aircraft off the runway. Yeah. So it's super important that we get it up to 40, stabilize, and then set takeoff thrust.
Yeah, it is super powerful. That asymmetric thrust can actually push you off the runway much quicker than you think. So it's really, really important that we do that. So we'll call stabilized. I'm then going to press toga. That's the buttons here on the thrust levers that will automatically set the takeoff thrust that we calculated yesterday, the 91.7%. It's going to start adding thrust. And my job now is to look out the window and keep the aircraft on the center line using the rudders. And we put light forward pressure on the control column. That just puts the weight on the nose wheel, because the rudder, when we move our feet, it moves the nose wheel and it moves the rudder. But until we get about 60, 70, 80 knots of air flowing over that rudder, it's not providing much directional control, but the nose wheel will be. So by putting a bit of forward pressure on the control column, it just puts a little bit of extra weight on the nose wheel, gives it a bit more authority until we get to 80 knots, at which point Petter would call 80 knots. I would then cross-check on my side to go, sure enough, it's about 80 knots. So I would say check. And that's quite a significant call. It marks a few things. So what's one of the reasons we check that, Petter?
All right. So I'm going to take two of them because you're speaking way too much here.
Go for it.
First of all, it's a cross-check of the airspeed indicator. So we're checking that both mine and your airspeed indicator are kind of roughly the same, and we also have the standby airspeed indicator. So they should be the same here. And if they're not, this is a good time to find it out so that we don't get airborne. But the most important point here is that 80 knots in the 737 marks the difference between the low speed takeoff regime and the high speed takeoff regime. Now, the significance of that is that up to 80 knots, we have not that much energy in the aircraft, and B, we haven't eaten much runway yet. We haven't accelerated so long so that we haven't eaten much runway. We have a lot of runway in front of us. And because of that, in the low speed regime, we can reject the takeoff for basically anything. So any weird sounds, smells, noises, master caution warning, anything that happens up to 80 knots, we just say stop and we reject the takeoff in a nice, slow and controlled way. And we have loads of runway to do so. At 80 knots and above, we have now accelerated much more. We've eaten up more runway. We have much more energy in the aircraft, so it's going to take us longer to stop. So from that point, Boeing have decided that in the high-speed regime, it is much safer to bring smaller failures into the air. Sort that out, do the non-normal checklist or whatever it is that you need to do in the air, and then bring the aircraft nice and slowly back in and land it with a full runway length available to you. So after 80 knots, we only abandon the takeoff engine failure, engine fire, severe damage to the engine, airplane unsafe, or unable to fly. Right. So it's basically those things. If you hear a bell or you see the aircraft is suddenly wearing because of an engine failure, then you stop. Otherwise, you just think, go, keep going, take the aircraft into the air, and you have loads of time to sort out whatever little problem it might be.
Yeah. Very well put. And for me personally, when I'm on the runway and I press toga, in my mind, I'm saying stop. I'm very stop orientated. And when we do the 80 knots check call, I actually say the words keep going in my head to try and actually change my mindset quickly from stop mindset to more of a keep going mindset, unless it's something very, very severe that Petter mentioned.
They're also asking if we reject for predicted wind shear, and yes, we do. That's one of the things that we stopped for before V1. So very good.
Yeah, excellent, guys. Nice job. Yeah, absolutely.
They're on the toes, you know.
Yeah, you guys are on it. So we're going to do that. We're going to get to 80 knots, and we're going to keep going, and we get to V1. We spoke about V1 more in detail today in the Q&A. So if you haven't seen that, go and check that out in the Facebook group. And then rotate, at which point I'm going to start pulling back gently on the control column. And the Boeing rate of rotation, it's a visual maneuver. So we're looking out the window, but just to show you what it looks like on here, our initial pitch attitude that we aim for is 15 degrees. So this is 10, 12 and a half, 15. And the rate of rotation is quite important, particularly in the 800, because of its stretched body. If we pull too quickly, we can get to a too high of a nose attitude before we get off the ground, and we can bonk the tail on the ground, which is not a great way to start your flight. So the correct method is to rotate at a rate of around 2 degrees per second, 2 to 2.5, which is a lot slower than people think. So if we're going to go to 15 degrees, it should take us probably about 7 or 8 seconds to go from on the runway to 15 degrees. So if my mouse cursor, you can see here, pretend that's the middle of the artificial horizon. As I rotate, it should come up at a rate of like 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007. So it's pretty slow. And a lot when we're training cadets, we really kind of drum that in, because what we don't want is a tail strike. So that's kind of the rate of rotation. And once we're airborne, we're going to follow the flight directives. And once we get airborne, we'll talk more about the flight directives. And then we're going to get to a point where we get a positive rate of climb. So once Petter sees that we have a rate of climb on our altimeter and our VSI, we're climbing from the ground. Petter, you will call
positive rate.
Yep, and I will call for gear up, at which point Petter will pull the lever out and raise it up. And the next thing we're waiting for while we're flying the flight directives is 400 feet on our radio altimeter. So this is our baro altimeter based on the pressure, and we have our radio altimeter here, which is based above the ground. So once this gets to 400, we're going to check that we have LNAV, lateral navigation engaged. That should be green. And that tells us that our guidance on our flight director is going to follow the magenta line. So we know that we're tracking the right thing. And then we're waiting now until we get to 1,000 feet, which will be 1,350-ish feet on the altimeter. That's when I'm going to engage the autopilot, Command A, and I'm going to call bug up, and I'm going to show you what we actually mean by that. We're going to move the speed bug to where it says up on our speed tape. The nose will lower, and you'll see the aircraft accelerating. And then once we're above the white bug, which we'll show you, I'm going to call for flap 1. Petter, what would you check at that point?
I would check that the speed is approaching is above the flaps 5 bug. We're not going to see here, but it's accelerating above the white, and I will select flaps 1.
Good. And then we go past the
flaps 1.
That's it. We check the speed and we go flap 1. And then once we get past the 1 bug, I will call flaps up. And Petter would go speed checks flaps up. And then we wait then until we get to 3,000. We keep climbing until we get to 3,000 feet above the ground. So I know this is a lot of information to take in, but the thing to do with this is to review it back and practice it. And so it's 1,000 feet to bug up. And then we get to 3,000 feet. The flaps will be up with no lights. Petter, you will call.
Flaps up, no light.
Good. And I will then engage VNAV, and I'll call for the after takeoff checklist. So that's what we're going to do. We'll run through it now in real time, and you'll see it all unfold.
And obviously, this is going to go very quickly when we're doing this in real time. So this is why we do these reviews. And exactly like Ben said, the idea with this is that you go back, you review it so that you get the theoretical knowledge behind what you do, and then you practice it a couple of times yourself, right?
Yeah.
So that's the whole idea. Now, I mean, the whole idea with this course, which I hope that you guys have started to understand by now, is that we will now we're trying to give you the knowledge needed in order for you not only to do the switching, do the, pushing the buttons at the right time, but actually understanding why you do it. Because once you do that, once you do understand it, it will mean so much more to you, and you will remember it much more because you remember stuff that you understand, Yeah. So this is the whole point with this course. This is the kind of added value that we're hoping to give you, because this is what we're giving to our cadets that are actually going out and flying these things.
Yeah, this is about from a home sim environment. This is genuinely about as real as it can get. So we're not really hiding anything here. This is what we would do if we're flying the real thing. And it will happen quickly, but again, practice, and you'll find yourself getting airborne like an absolute pro. Right, Petter, are you ready to go flying?
I am ready to go flying. I just want to tell you good luck. We're all counting on you.
Okay, good. So shall we call ready for departure?
Affirm. So Stansted Tower, Butter 001, ready for departure.
Butter 001, line up and wait, runway 22 via Sierra 1.
Lining up and wait, runway 22 via Sierra 1, Butter 001.
Good. So now we've got the clearance to line up. We can do the below the line checks. Okay, so the first officer, Petter, if he was in the right seat or he's training me, he would now come across, and we do a few things now. So you're going to arm the auto throttle. So we're going to lift that up, and that now arms the auto throttle to set takeoff thrust when we press toga. We've got LNAV armed. The little white bit here tells you that it's armed and not active. That will come active once we get airborne. And then we're going to come down and we're going to turn the transponder. Lulu will be pleased to know this because I always forget this when I'm doing it in the previous one, when we're doing other demos, that is. We're going to go to TARA. So that's where we arm the traffic advisory or resolution advisory system that will alert us if any other aircraft start getting too close to us. So they're the things that pilot monitoring would do. And then you would read the checklist to make sure that we're done.
Okay, so below the line, MCP.
Yep. MCP is set.
Transponder.
TARA.
Strobe lights.
So as we line up, we put the strobe lights to strobe and steady. So then we get the white flashing lights coming on.
Okay, holding on landing lights.
Good. So now what I'm going to do to increase our visibility, I actually turn all of the lights on, but turn the taxi light off. And that is another aid memoir to remind us that we haven't got cleared for takeoff yet. We only put this light on once we've been cleared for takeoff. Actually, that should be on. I just noticed that. So now we're ready to go. So before we line up, we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So I would say to Petter, confirm readback.
Okay, we're clear to line up and wait, runway 22 via Sierra 1.
Good. And I would say, right, clear left. I'd look to make sure nothing's rolling or departing over here.
Clear right and on the final.
Good. Okay, so now I'm going to start rolling onto the runway. Make sure the brakes off might help. Just get the brakes off here. There we go. And we're now going to line up. So now we move. Once we go past this line in front of us, we're now on an active runway. So now it starts to get serious. We've got to be careful with what we're doing, as always. But we're now going on to an active runway. This runway is now ours. So we line up nice and slowly. And we would tell the cabin crew seats for departure. That makes sure that they're sitting down and they're ready. And the cabin now is absolutely safe and secure, ready for our departure. Nice day to go flying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So let's line. So again, we're going to overshoot the taxiway line just a little bit. I'm going to bring it back below 10 knots. You can see just on here, we're at 9 knots. That's good. And I'm going to start a nice gentle turn to get us onto the center line of the runway. And I'm going to bring it to a stop there. So there we are. We're nicely on the runway. And we would normally have something called a RAS or RSAT that will tell us that we are on runway 22. So it tells us that we're on the right runway. But if we don't have that, once we get cleared for takeoff, before we start timing and setting thrust, we just check that our track here matches very closely our runway track. If that was very wrong, particularly in low visibility or at nighttime, it might mean you've lined up on the wrong runway, particularly if you've got runways that are crossing at the entry point.
Yeah, Dublin is a great example of that.
It is. Runway 28 left and runway 34 is a very good one, isn't it? Yeah. So, okay. So Butter 01, you're clear takeoff runway 22, surface wind 240 degrees, 7 knots.
Clear for takeoff runway 22, Butter 001.
Okay. So now we're cleared for takeoff and I would say complete the landing checks.
Landing lights.
So they're all on.
Before takeoff checklist is complete.
Good. So now we would hit the stopwatch to get the timer going. And I would say 219, 222 timing. And here we go. So we're going to bring thrust up to 40%. You see, it takes a long time to spool up.
Stabilize.
Stabilize. So I'm going to press toga. And the thrust comes up by itself now. Set takeoff thrust.
Okay. Takeoff thrust set. Indications normal.
Good. So in my mind, I'm thinking stop. I'm cross-checking the instruments and the airspeed.
80 knots.
Checked. Keep going in my mind. I'm checking everything while I'm maintaining the center line.
V1. Rotate.
So I'm going to start the rotation maneuver now, nice and gently. And so gear up. Gear up. So the gear's now going up. And I'm going to follow these flight directors now. You can see they're nicely crossed. So there's 400 feet. So I would call LNAV.
LNAV.
And I'm waiting now for 1,350 feet. Where it is, there's 1,350. So I'm going to go Command A and I check that we have command here now. So the autopilot's now flying the airplane, and I'm going to call bug up. So we move our magenta bug on our speed tape to where it says up, and you can see the aircraft is now going to nose down, thrust, and the aircraft will start accelerating. So once we're above the white bug and accelerating, I'm going to call for flap 1.
Speed checks, flaps 1.
So Peter then selects flap 1, and that gets traveling. Once we get above the 1, there's 1 to go. I'm going to call for flaps up.
Speed checks, flaps up.
And the flaps are traveling nicely, and we're waiting now to level off, and we're going out to that 3.1 miles, which is this waypoint here. So the aircraft is starting to level off nicely at 4,000 feet. You can see it's lowering the nose, and Petter will be looking over here now if I move so you can see it.
And flaps up, no light.
Good. So we're making sure the aircraft is actually leveling off, and I would call then for the after takeoff checklist.
Good.
So Petter, you would move the gear from up to maybe the curious position of off. Why do we do that? What's the purpose?
So this is the checklist is one of the only ones that we do from memory. Generally, this is like a scan flow in the air. So I would go up and I will turn I will check whether or not the this anti-ice is used or not, and I will put the start switches to off if they're not, and then go down, like Ben indicated, landing gear up and off. And the only reason you want to do that is because in the up position, the retraction unit is actually pressurized by hydraulics, right? And once the gear is up, it's an up block that comes into position and holds the gear in the up position. So there's no need for that hydraulic circuit to be pressurized. So I can turn that off, right? This is a position that doesn't exist in the 737 MAX, by the way. This is only in the Classics and the NG. So off, and then the auto brake to off. I'll make sure that the flaps are up, no lights. And then the last thing I will do this silently, by the way, by myself, going through the checklist. And the last thing I will do is I will call altimeters. But generally speaking, I normally hold that until we are clear to climb to a flight level. But in this case, we're going to maintain 3,000 feet. So I'll call altimeters.
Okay, so we're maintaining QNH of 1023, maintaining 4,000 feet. And we would also, as you had said, we just have a quick look at the pressurization just to make sure that the aircraft is pressure. So we kind of do what we call the reverse L. So this is the pressurization here. So we go across to make sure that we've got a pressure building in the cabin. We might have a rate of climb for climbing. We check that we've got it in auto, the correct settings, bleeds on, packs auto, and we check the temperature. So it's like a reverse L position. And then that'll be the end of the after takeoff checklist.
After takeoff checklist complete.
And ladies and gents, that's where we're going to leave it tonight. Okay, so if you're following through in real time, you can by all means carry on and get flying, do a bit of practice. Tomorrow we're going to show you what we're going to do to build on this. We've obviously got lots and lots more in this. We've only just got Airborne. So tomorrow is going to be a great session where we're going to build on what we've already learned over the last few days. Definitely not one to miss.
Yep.
Sorry, Paddy, were you going to say something?
Yeah, those of you who are on Mentor Now, if you look at the chat, I've pinned a URL, a link in the top. You can use that to join the Facebook group. And the reason you want to use that is to get access to the workbook and the checklists and the plates and stuff that we've been using. Because if you want to really do the course, that's what you're going to need. So do that. I know not everyone has Facebook or are using Facebook. We're working on a solution for that. But right now, that's where you'll find it. So just go there, sign up, go to the Facebook group, and you will have all of the checklists and everything that we've been using up until this point are available for you. And I really, really hope to see you tomorrow, because like Ben is saying, we're just kind of scratching the surface here of the kind of stuff that we're hoping to teach with this course. So turn in tomorrow. Same time.
Really looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. And if you've got any questions from today, or if you're watching this back, remember I'm live tomorrow at 12 UTC, where again, these Q&A sessions are great fun. We had a great time today. We delve deep. Petter's nerd bell starts going off without him even realizing it. We deep dive into the system. So if you've got any questions, practice this. If something doesn't work, come and ask me. That's the beauty of this course. You've got myself here to guide you, rather than to search on Google and go and do all the other bits. I'm there to help. So please do ask me. If you can't make it live, just send me an email or a message and I will answer it for you. So when you watch it back, I've answered that.
That's the thing, guys. Like where else are you going to find two TRI TREs that are doing this? Like I love doing this because, as you have shown us, there's so much enthusiasm. There's so much great energy in this group already. Those of you who are on Mentor Now, you'll find that same kind of energy in this Facebook group because it's ongoing discussions. It's not only when the video is live; it's actually throughout. And Ben is doing some amazing job when it comes to Q&As. So anything that you have been thinking about, even if it doesn't have to do with today's session, he will be able to answer it. And that's the strength here. Like you will have this chance to ask these questions here now until tomorrow.
Yeah, so do make the most of it. And on that note, ladies and gents, absolute pleasure as always. Great seeing so many of you here, and we will look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great night.
Have a great night, guys. It's been lovely. See you tomorrow.
Take care, everyone. Bye.